The rain soaked through my coat in seconds. That's when I knew my son's wife really threw me out on Christmas night. She stood on the porch and called me a freeloader, said it was her house. But then my longtime driver pulled up, and what he told me changed everything. He revealed that the house wasn't Crystal's, it was mine, and 3 others too. I was the owner all along, hiding it out of love. My name is Dorothy, and this is how a secret I kept in silence taught my family who really held the keys. For years, I'd lived quietly in that house, content to be the invisible grandmother who cooked, cleaned, and asked for nothing. But on that Christmas night, Crystal's words stripped away any illusion of family. To her, I was a drain on their finances, a burden who'd overstayed her welcome. What she didn't know, what my driver had kept silent for a decade, was that the roof she stood under, the walls she called hers, everything was bought and paid for by me. I'd hidden my ownership to keep the peace. Now that secret was about to explode, and the question wasn't whether I'd survive the storm, but what mercy, if any, I'd show the people who threw me into it. I had married young and buried my husband even younger. By the time Michael was 10, I was a widow running a small accounting firm from my kitchen table. The house on Larkspur Lane was the first thing I ever owned outright, bought with his life insurance and every penny I'd saved. Over the years, I added 3 more properties, rental units scattered across town. Nothing fancy, just brick and siding and steady tenants who paid on time. I kept my name on nothing visible. The cars were old, the furniture was worn, and Michael grew up thinking we were comfortable but never wealthy. That was by design. I wanted him to build his own life, not wait for me to leave. Michael met Crystal at a sales conference when he was 31. She was all confidence and sharp angles, blonde hair cut in a severe bob, nails like little red weapons, a laugh that filled a room but never reached her eyes the way it should. I tried to like her. I truly did. But something about the way she inventoried our house on her first visit, scanning the china cabinet and the silverware as if calculating their worth, made me quiet. Michael, lonely and still bruised from a previous breakup, fell hard. They married within the year. I paid for the wedding, a modest affair at the garden club. I told myself I was being generous, not controlling. But I was stitching myself into their lives whether they wanted me there or not. After the honeymoon, they moved into a cramped apartment on the south side. Money was tight. Michael had been passed over for a promotion, Crystal's sales commissions were unpredictable, and they were drowning in credit card debt. So when Michael asked if they could move in with me temporarily, just for a year or 2, until they got on their feet, I didn't hesitate. I cleared out the upstairs bedrooms, gave them the master suite with the private bath, and moved my own things into the small sewing room off the kitchen. It felt like the right thing to do. The motherly thing. I didn't mention that the house was fully paid for, or that I owned several others. I wanted them to see me as a helper, not a bank. The first year was peaceful, even warm. I cooked, I cleaned, I watched their dog when they traveled for work. Crystal called me Mama D and sometimes brought me tea in the garden. I let myself believe that my son had chosen well, that my early misgivings had been unfair. But quiet resentments have a way of fermenting. Crystal began making small comments about the house, how outdated the kitchen was, how the neighborhood was declining, how a renovation could double its value if we ever decide to sell. That was my first warning sign. Then came the questions about where I kept the deed, whether I had a will, whether I trusted anyone to manage my affairs. She asked it all with a smile, like her concern was for my health and safety. I answered vaguely, deflected, and kept my documents locked in a safe deposit box she knew nothing about. By the second year, the mask slipped. Crystal stopped asking and started telling. She'd rearrange furniture without asking, throw out my old photo albums to make space, invite her friends over for dinner parties that ran past midnight while I lay in my tiny room pretending to sleep. Michael, caught between us, did what he'd always done. He avoided conflict. He'd kiss my forehead, tell me she was just stressed from work, and disappear into his home office. I started feeling like a guest in my own house. A tolerated guest, barely. The meals I cooked went uneaten. The garden I'd planted for my late husband was paved over for a fire pit. My opinions were met with tight smiles and swift changes of subject. I was fading, and I knew it. Christmas Eve was the breaking point. Crystal's parents, a couple from the coast with money and condescension to spare, arrived for the weekend. They brought wine I couldn't pronounce, gifts wrapped in metallic paper, and an air of unshakable superiority. I spent the day in the kitchen, roasting a goose, setting the table with my mother's china, trying to be invisible and indispensable at the same time. At dinner, Crystal's father made a toast to family and to the beautiful home Crystal and Michael have built together. He lifted his glass toward Crystal, not me. I saw my son's face flicker. He knew it wasn't right, but he raised his glass anyway. Later, over dessert, Crystal brought up the idea of me moving into a lovely retirement community she'd researched. I laughed it off, but she wasn't laughing. Her eyes were steady, calculating. The rest of the meal passed in a strained silence. That night, as I washed dishes alone, I heard them arguing in the living room. Crystal's voice, sharp and carrying. "She's been living off us for years, Michael. It's our house now. We've put money into it, we've maintained it. She's just occupying space." Michael's voice was low, pleading, something about loyalty, about his mother. But Crystal cut him off. "Loyalty doesn't pay the mortgage. We can't keep living like this. It's not fair to us." I didn't hear Michael's reply. I didn't need to. I dried my hands, went to my little room, and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time since my husband died, I felt genuinely homeless, despite sitting within the walls I owned. Christmas Day was gray and cold, a storm gathering over the hills. The morning brought false cheer, gifts opened, coffee drunk, the usual pantomime of family unity. But the tension from the night before hadn't dissipated. It had just coiled tighter. By late afternoon, the rain began. Hard, freezing, driven sideways by a wind that rattled the windows. Crystal's parents had left early, spooked by the forecast. It was just the three of us now, and the silence was thunderous. I made hot chocolate. Crystal didn't thank me. She stood by the window, watching the storm, and then without turning said, "This house is too big for just you, Dorothy. Don't you think it's time for a change?" I steadied my voice. "I'm quite comfortable, thank you." She turned then, and the mask was fully gone. Her face was flushed with something between anger and exhilaration. "Comfortable? You've been freeloading off your own son for 2 years. You don't pay rent. You don't contribute. This is Crystal's house now, mine and Michael's, and I want you out." Michael stepped forward, horrified. "Crystal, stop." But she didn't stop. She grabbed my coat from the hook by the door and shoved it into my arms. "Go. Now stand outside and think about what you've been taking from us." I looked at my son. He stood frozen, one hand half raised, mouth open, eyes pleading for something, maybe for me to fight back, maybe for me to just leave quietly so the conflict would end. I waited for him to speak, to defend me, to say the house was mine in more ways than she could comprehend. But he said nothing, not a word. So I walked out the front door into the rain and the wind, my coat barely thrown over my shoulders, the door slamming behind me with the force of the gale. The cold hit me like a wall of nails. Within seconds, my clothes were soaked through. I stood on the front walk, rain streaming down my face, and looked back at the lit windows of my own home. Through the glass, I could see Crystal's silhouette, arms crossed, triumphant. Michael was nowhere in sight. I pulled out my phone with numb fingers and dialed the one number I'd never had to use in an emergency until now. It rang twice. Henry, I said, my teeth chattering. I need you to come get me. Henry had been my driver for 11 years, ever since I'd bought the first rental property, and needed someone to help me manage the logistics. He was more than a driver, he was a keeper of secrets, a witness to every document signed and every decision made. His black sedan pulled up to the curb 7 minutes later, the longest 7 minutes of my life. He got out, holding an umbrella, and saw me standing there drenched and shaking. Without a word, he draped his own coat over my shoulders and guided me into the back seat, turning the heat to full. The car smelled of leather and peppermint, familiar and safe. For a long moment, he didn't start the engine. He just sat there, staring at the house through the rain-streaked windshield. Then he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. Mrs. Dorothy, did you finally tell them the truth? I shook my head, unable to form words. Henry turned in his seat to face me directly, his expression unreadable. Then, it's time you did. Because that house isn't Crystal's. It never was. And there's something else you need to know about who you really are and what you've been protecting them from all these years. I stared at Henry, the rain still pounding against the car roof. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold his coat closed around me. What do you mean who I really am? Henry put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb slowly, deliberately, as if we had all the time in the world. I've worked for you for 11 years, Mrs. Dorothy. I've driven you to every property closing, every bank meeting, every tenant dispute. Not once have you told your son the truth about what you own. And not once has that woman ever asked you a single question that wasn't designed to strip you of it. We drove through the empty Christmas streets, the storm turning the world into a blur of water and gray light. Henry didn't take the route toward my rentals or toward town. Instead, he turned into a small office park I didn't recognize, a low brick building with a single light burning over the door. He parked, killed the engine, and turned to face me fully. This is where I keep the records. The real ones, he said. The ones you never wanted Michael to see because you thought it would make him feel inadequate. The ones Crystal has been trying to find for 18 months. I followed him inside, still dripping, still numb. The office was sparse, a desk, a filing cabinet, a computer, a wall safe. Henry gestured to a chair, and I sat. He opened the safe first, pulling out a thick manila folder, the kind I recognized from 100 real estate transactions. Inside were deeds, titles, insurance documents. He laid them on the desk one by one. 312 Larkspur Lane, he said, tapping the first document. Your primary residence. Purchased outright, no mortgage, 26 years ago. Value today, approximately $410,000. He moved to the next. 407 Maple Street. 2-unit rental. Purchased 14 years ago. Fully paid. Value, $275,000. Then a third. 1820 Birchwood Avenue. Single family. Purchased 9 years ago. Also fully paid. Value, $220,000. And finally, the last. 91 Elm Court. A triplex. Acquired 7 years ago through a quiet title after the previous owner defaulted. You paid the back taxes and assumed the deed. Value, $350,000. That one produces the most income. I looked at the papers, at the numbers, at the totality of what I'd quietly built over decades. I'd never seen them all together like this. The sum was staggering. My hands stopped shaking. Not from warmth, but from the weight of realization. I owned 4 houses. I had tenants who paid rent every month into an account I barely checked. I was, by any reasonable measure, wealthy. And I'd let my son and his wife call me a freeloader while I slept in a sewing room. The total value, conservatively, is over $1.2 million, Henry said. And that doesn't include the liquid assets. You've been living like a dependent because you didn't want Michael to feel pressured to support you, or to wait for an inheritance. But that generosity has been used against you. I swallowed hard. How long have you known Crystal was digging? Henry opened a drawer and pulled out a smaller folder. This one with handwritten notes, printed emails, and surveillance photos. About 6 months after she moved in, he said, I noticed little things first. She'd go through the mail before you got to it. She asked me once what your monthly income was, casually, like she was just concerned about your retirement. Then a tenant at the Maple Street property called me, said a woman claiming to be your daughter-in-law had shown up asking about the building's ownership. Said she was helping with estate planning. I started watching more carefully after that. He handed me a photo. It showed Crystal at a coffee shop, sitting across from a man I didn't recognize, mid-50s, hard-faced, wearing a cheap suit. That's Leonard Cross, Henry said. He's a self-described asset recovery specialist. His specialty is convincing elderly homeowners to sign over their property to family members through coercive care agreements. He's been investigated twice in 2 states, but never charged. Crystal met with him at least 4 times that I've documented. She's been building a legal case to declare you mentally incompetent and take control of everything. The word incompetent hit me like a second blast of cold. I'd been a professional accountant my whole life. I'd managed complex portfolios, navigated tax law, kept my mind sharp and my records sharper. And this woman, this stranger living in my house, was trying to convince the world that I couldn't manage my own affairs. But here's the thing that changed everything, Henry continued, his voice dropping. When I started digging into Crystal's background, I found something she's been hiding from everyone, including your son. He pulled out another document, this one a printout from a database. Crystal isn't her real name, or rather, it's one of several. Her legal name is Christine Elaine Voss. She changed it legally 4 years ago in Nevada after a fraud case was dismissed on a technicality. Before that, she operated as Chrissy Landers in Arizona, where she married a man named Harold Pettigrew, moved into his house with his elderly father, and within 18 months the father was in a state facility and the house had been sold. The proceeds disappeared. Harold filed a police report, but she vanished before charges could be filed. I stared at the photograph attached to the printout, a younger Crystal. Different hair, but the same cold eyes. Henry handed me another page. And before that, she was Crystal Hammond in Oregon. Same pattern. Marries a man with aging parents, isolates them, plants doubts about their mental capacity, then liquidates the assets. She's done this at least 3 times that I can prove. Maybe more. My son. My gentle, conflict-avoidant, lonely son had married a serial predator. The walls of the office seemed to tilt. Why hasn't she been arrested? No one's been able to make a case stick, Henry said. She's smart. She never directly steals. She convinces family members to make voluntary decisions. The money goes into joint accounts, then gets moved through a maze of shell companies. By the time anyone figures it out, she's in a new state with a new name and a new mark. Your son isn't a husband to her, he's a vehicle. And you're the target. The house on Larkspur Lane is just the beginning. She's after the whole portfolio. I pressed my palms flat against the desk to steady myself. Outside, the storm raged on. Somewhere in town, Crystal was probably celebrating her victory, thinking she'd finally pushed me out. She didn't know I was sitting in an office with 11 years of documentation that could destroy her. What do we do now? I asked. Henry reached back into the safe and pulled out a small digital recorder. We already have enough to go to the police, he said. The tenant statements, the photos of her meeting with Cross, the background check on her aliases. But we need one more thing. A recorded admission. She's been careful, but tonight she's probably feeling invincible. She just threw you out on Christmas. She thinks she's won. If we can get her to say something incriminating, something that proves intent to defraud you, the district attorney can move forward with charges that will actually hold. And Michael? Henry's expression softened, just slightly. Your son is a victim in this too. He has no idea who he married. But he also stood there tonight while she threw you into a storm. He'll have to face that eventually, after we stop her. The question is, will you be ready to show him the truth, even if it breaks his heart? I thought of my son, his silence at the door, his pleading eyes that asked me not to fight back. He'd been trained by Crystal over 2 years to doubt me, to see me as a burden. He was trapped as much as I was. But the only way to free him was to tear down the illusion she'd built. I'm ready, I said. Where do we start? Henry nodded, stood, and picked up the recorder. We start at the house. Right now, while she's still riding high on her little victory. You walk back in, and you let her talk. I'll be right outside, recording everything. She won't be able to resist gloating. And when she's done, you tell her the truth, that the house is yours, that the other properties are yours, and that her scheme is over. He paused, his hand on the door. But there's something else you need to know before we go. Something I found just this morning that changes everything you thought you knew about why she targeted your family specifically. It wasn't random. She didn't pick Michael by accident. Someone pointed her at you. Someone who knew about the properties years before Crystal ever came into the picture. I felt the floor drop away. Who? Henry held up a final document, a letter, handwritten, on stationery from a local bank. Your late husband's former business partner, the one you had a falling out with after he died. He's been nursing a grudge for 20 years, and he's the one who fed Crystal information about your assets. She's not working alone. And if we're going to stop her, we have to stop him too. The name on the letter hit me like a physical blow. Marcus Webb, my husband's former partner. I hadn't spoken that name aloud in 23 years. After Arthur died, Marcus had tried to muscle me out of the accounting firm we'd built together. He'd claimed Arthur promised him majority share, produced a dubious handwritten agreement, and when I fought back with the actual incorporation papers, he'd lost. The firm dissolved, I took my clients, he left town bitter and broke, or so I'd thought. But the letter Henry held was dated 3 years ago, addressed to Crystal, with details about my properties, my rental income, even a rough estimate of my net worth. Marcus had been watching from somewhere in the shadows, feeding her information, guiding her toward me like a heat-seeking missile. He lives 2 towns over, Henry said. Runs a small tax preparation service now, nothing flashy. But he's been corresponding with Crystal via encrypted email for over 2 years. I found the emails when I hacked her cloud backup. She's been paying him a percentage of whatever she could extract from you, 10% of the Larkspur house if she could get you out. He's the one who told her about the sewing room arrangement, about how you'd never assert ownership, about your fear of conflict with Michael. I felt cold fury replacing the numbness. For 2 decades, I'd thought Marcus was a sad, defeated man who'd slunk away into obscurity. Instead, he'd been nursing his revenge, waiting for an opportunity to destroy me through my own family. And Crystal was his perfect weapon, a predator who'd already destroyed 3 families, now aimed directly at mine. Does he know about tonight? I asked. No. But he will soon. Crystal will call him the moment she thinks she's succeeded. That gives us maybe an hour to get back to the house and set the trap. We drove through the storm in silence. I was still wearing Henry's coat over my soaked dress, my hair plastered to my scalp, my hands raw from cold. But I wasn't shivering anymore. The anger was burning away every other sensation. I kept seeing Michael's face at the door, that frozen indecision, that silence that cut deeper than Crystal's words. He had stood there while I was cast out like garbage, but I also saw the boy he'd been, the teenager who'd helped me plant the garden, the young man who'd cried at his father's funeral. He was in there somewhere, buried under 2 years of manipulation. I had to believe that. When we turned onto Larkspur Lane, the house was still lit. every window glowing gold against the black storm. Henry parked half a block away, out of sight. He handed me the recorder, a tiny device I could clip inside my coat. "I'll be right outside the front door," he said. "If anything goes wrong, I'm coming in. But you have to let her talk. Get her to admit she threw you out, that she's been planning this, and if possible, mention Marcus. The more she says, the more airtight the case." I walked back to my own front door in the pouring rain, the recorder warm against my chest. I didn't knock. I used my key. The door swung open into the living room, and the scene inside stopped me cold on the threshold. Crystal was sitting on my sofa, a glass of wine in her hand, her feet up on my coffee table. My mother's china teacup, the one I'd cherished since my own childhood, was sitting beside her, used as an ashtray. The Christmas tree lights were still on, twinkling merrily over the wreckage of opened gifts, and Michael was on the far side of the room, slumped in an armchair, his head in his hands. He looked up when I entered, and his face went pale. "Back so soon?" Crystal didn't bother to turn around. "I thought the storm would teach you a lesson about overstaying your welcome." I closed the door behind me, my wet shoes squelching on the hardwood floor. "I'd like to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Now she turned. Her eyes narrowed when she saw Henry's coat over my shoulders. "Where did you get that?" "Who picked you up?" "An old friend. Someone who's been watching out for me for a very long time. Someone who told me some very interesting things about you, Christine." The name landed like a grenade. Crystal's face didn't flinch, but the wine glass in her hand went perfectly still. Michael looked between us, confused. "Who's Christine?" "Your wife," I said. Or rather, one of her versions. Her legal name is Christine Elaine Voss. Before that, she was Chrissy Landers in Arizona, where she married a man named Harold Pettigrew, stripped his family's assets, and disappeared. Before that, she was Crystal Hammond in Oregon, same pattern. She's a serial predator who targets men with aging parents. And Michael, you are not her husband. You are her access card to my properties. The room was silent except for the rain hammering the roof. Michael stood up slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Crystal laughed, a brittle, dangerous sound. She's clearly been wandering around in the cold and lost her mind. "Did you hit your head out there, Dorothy? Should we call someone?" "I have evidence," I said. "Marriage certificates, police reports, photos of you meeting with Leonard Cross, the man who helps you fabricate incompetency claims, tenant statements from when you tried to claim my Maple Street building. And I have your correspondence with Marcus Webb, the man who gave you my name in the first place." At the mention of Marcus, Crystal's composure cracked. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed her face. That was the moment I knew Henry was right. She hadn't planned for anyone connecting her to her informant. Michael took a step toward her. "Crystal, is any of this true?" She recovered quickly, setting down the wine glass with deliberate care. "Your mother has clearly been plotting against me for months. She's been resentful since we moved in, you know that. She's never accepted me. Now she's fabricating an elaborate story to turn you against me. Don't let her do this." But Michael was looking at me now, really looking. "Mom, what evidence?" I pulled out my phone where Henry had uploaded the key documents, marriage license from Arizona, under the name Chrissy Landers, Harold Pettigrew's police report from 6 years ago, another from Oregon before that, and this photo of Crystal meeting with Leonard Cross at a coffee shop 3 weeks ago. She's been planning to have me declared incompetent so she could sell our family home out from under me, and not just this house. She's after everything I own, and she's had a partner feeding her information for 2 years. Crystal's face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, then fury, then something colder. Calculated, she turned to Michael, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Michael, don't listen to her. We've talked about this. She's been declining. She forgets things, she's paranoid. This is exactly what we were afraid of. We need to call Dr. Reeves, we can get her help. But Michael had seen the photo. He leaned down, picked up the phone, and stared at the image of his wife meeting with a stranger. Who is this man, Crystal? Why were you meeting with him? She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't have a smooth answer. And in that silence, I saw my son's heart break. That's what I thought. Michael said, his voice hollow. You've been lying to me this whole time. Crystal's composure shattered into rage. She turned on me, all pretense gone. You think you've won, you old witch? You think some photos and a few old police reports will change anything? I've been doing this for 12 years. I've taken down families with more money and better lawyers than you. I'll be gone before any charges can stick, and by the time the court's sorted out, you'll be dead and buried. That's how this works. Every word was ice clear on the recorder. I didn't flinch. Tell me about Marcus Webb. How did he find you? She laughed, a sound with no humor at all. Marcus? He didn't find me. I found him. I was researching the county tax records, saw your name attached to multiple properties. An old woman with no visible income living like a pauper? That's my favorite kind of target. But I needed to know if there were any heirs who might fight back. Marcus's name came up in a business dispute archive. I reached out, bought him a drink, and he spilled everything. The sewing room, the guilt Michael felt about his father dying young, your pathological need to avoid conflict. He said all I had to do was isolate you from your son, make you feel like a burden, and you'd eventually hand over the keys just to keep the peace. And you know what? He was right. Michael made a sound I'd never heard before, something between a gasp and a sob. He was looking at Crystal as if seeing her for the first time. You researched my family before you met me. Our whole relationship was a job, sweetheart, a very lucrative one. She picked up her wine glass again, took a sip, utterly unbothered. But the storm was a nice touch, I'll admit. I didn't know it would rain tonight, but it sure helped motivate you, didn't it, Dorothy? Standing out there like a drowning cat. I almost felt bad for you. Almost, I kept my voice calm. What was the plan after I was out? She shrugged. Simple, estate planning documents already drafted. Michael signs what I tell him to sign because he's terrified of conflict, and he loves me. You're moved to a facility, your assets liquidated, the money funneled through 3 accounts to Costa Rica. Michael gets a divorce he didn't see coming, and I vanish. Just like Phoenix. Just like Portland. The only difference this time was the scale. You built quite the little empire for a woman who never left her sewing room. I took a step forward. I'd been calm long enough. Let me tell you something, Christine. You've been living in my house, sleeping in my bed, eating my food, and calling me a freeloader. But you never did your homework on me. Yes, I'm quiet. Yes, I avoid conflict. But I'm also the woman who built this empire from nothing after my husband died at 34 years old. I raised a son alone, ran a business, bought 4 houses with my own money, and never missed a single payment. You think a little rain and some cruel words would break me? I've survived things you can't imagine. Crystal's smirk didn't waver. Lovely speech. But you're still standing here soaked and pathetic, and I'm still going to walk out of this house and be gone before the police can even spell extradition. You have no idea how fast I can disappear. Then the front door opened, and Henry stepped inside. Behind him stood 2 uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective I'd never seen before. Crystal's glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. Actually, Henry said, holding up his phone, we've been recording everything you said for the past 10 minutes. And Detective Morrison here has been listening from the car. We also have warrants waiting for you in Arizona and Oregon. You're not disappearing anywhere tonight. Crystal lunged for the back door, but one of the officers intercepted her with practiced ease. She screamed, a raw animal sound as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. She fought, kicked, spat curses at me, at Michael, at Henry, at the whole world. But the fight was gone from her. The woman who'd destroyed 3 families and nearly destroyed mine was finally completely cornered. As they led her out into the storm, Michael stood motionless in the middle of the room, tears streaming down his face. He looked at me, his voice breaking. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have stopped her. I should have believed you." I crossed the room and took his hands. "You were deceived by an expert. She did this before, to others, and they didn't see it either. But now, you know the truth. Not just about her, but about everything. There's more I need to tell you, about the houses, about the money, about why I hid it from you all these years, and about what comes next. Because Marcus Webb is still out there, and he's not going to stop until he's faced justice too." The storm finally broke around midnight. The police car pulled away with Crystal still screaming in the back seat, her threats muffled by the rain and the closed door. The living room was a wreck, gift wrap trampled, wine soaking into the rug, my mother's china teacup still sitting there with cigarette ash. Michael hadn't moved from the center of the room. He stood there staring at the door like he expected her to come back, like the last 2 years might rewind if he just stood still enough. Henry quietly excused himself to coordinate with the detective, leaving just the 2 of us in the silence. I walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle, set it on the stove. Some things you do because they make sense when nothing else does. When the tea was ready, I poured 2 cups and set one in front of my son. He looked at it without seeing it. "She was never real," he said, his voice a hollow shell. 2 years of my life, and she was just playing a role. "She's been playing roles for 12 years, I said. "You weren't the first, Michael. You won't be the last she tried to destroy. But you're the one who gets to walk away." He looked up then, eyes red-rimmed. "You knew. Somehow you knew enough to record her. How?" So I told him. I told him about Henry, about the properties, about the files and the records and the 11 years of quiet management. I brought out the deeds I'd had Henry bring from the office, spread them on the kitchen table next to the cooling tea. 312 Larkspur Lane, this house, purchased outright when you were 5 years old. 407 Maple Street, a 2-unit rental. 1820 Birchwood Avenue. 981 Elm Court, a triplex. All paid for, all generating income. I never told you because I wanted you to build your own life without waiting for me to die. But I see now that my silence made you vulnerable. It created a void that Crystal filled with lies. Michael picked up the deed to Larkspur Lane, his hands shaking. "You've owned this place the whole time, and I let her call you a freeloader. I let her throw you out of your own house. I let her do it too," I said. "I was so afraid of conflict, so afraid of driving you away, that I let a predator operate in my own home for 2 years. We both made mistakes. But the difference is, we can fix ours. She can't fix hers anymore." Over the next 2 weeks, the full scope of Crystal's crimes came into focus. Detective Morrison worked with the district attorney's office, and Henry's recordings proved invaluable. Crystal, Christine Voss, was charged with attempted fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Within days, Arizona and Oregon filed their own warrants. Harold Pettigrew flew in to give a statement. So did the children of George Murphy, another victim who had since passed. One by one, the families Crystal had torn apart came forward, and the weight of evidence became insurmountable. Her lawyer tried to argue entrapment, but the recording we made in my living room was clear. She had freely admitted her schemes, named her collaborator, and shown no remorse. That collaborator was the next target. Marcus Webb was arrested at his tax preparation office on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after Christmas. The police found his correspondence with Crystal on his computer, along with financial records showing payments she'd made to him over the course of 2 years. His defense was desperate. He claimed he was just offering her business advice, that he had no idea she was a con artist. But the emails were damning. Detailed breakdowns of my holdings, suggestions for how to isolate me from Michael, even drafts of the competency hearing paperwork they planned to file. He was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and elder abuse. I attended his bail hearing, sat in the back of the courtroom, and watched him scan the room with wild eyes until they landed on me. He mouthed something I couldn't hear. It didn't matter. I'd already won. Michael started therapy the week after Crystal's arrest. Twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He found a counselor who specialized in victims of relationship fraud, and the process was slow and painful. Some nights he'd come home and go straight to his room, barely speak, just sit with the door closed. Other nights he'd join me in the kitchen and we'd talk for hours about his father, about the pressures of being the child of a widow, about the ways he'd felt like he never measured up. I apologized for my part in that, for making my love look like sacrifice, for hiding my strength when he needed to see it. And he apologized too, not just for Christmas night, but for the 1,000 small betrayals that had led up to it. The properties, meanwhile, needed attention. I hadn't visited my rentals in months, trusting Henry to manage the day-to-day, but now I wanted to see them again, not as hidden assets, but as the tangible evidence of my life's work. Michael came with me. We drove to Maple Street first, a sturdy 2-unit building with a fresh coat of paint and tenants who greeted me warmly. Then Birchwood, a little house with a garden I'd planted myself and then forgotten about. Finally, Elm Court, the triplex that had been the most recent acquisition. Michael walked through each unit, asked questions about the tenants, about the mortgages that no longer existed, about the work that goes into being a steward of other people's homes. For the first time in his life, he was seeing me not as his aging mother, but as a capable, independent woman with a business. I had no idea, he said as we stood on the porch of Elm Court, looking out at the quiet street. You did all this alone. I wasn't alone, I said. I had Henry, I had your father's memory, and I had you. Even when I didn't tell you everything, you were always the reason I kept going. I wanted to leave you something, Michael, but not something you'd wait for. Something that would free you. He was quiet for a long moment. I don't want the houses. I don't want the money. I just want to learn how to be a better son. You already are, I said. You just didn't know it yet. By the end of January, Crystal accepted a plea deal, 10 to 15 years in federal prison for multiple counts of fraud and identity theft. The deal required her to provide full restitution to her victims, though we suspected most of the money was long gone. Marcus Webb's case was still pending, but the evidence was airtight, and the prosecutor expected a conviction. With the legal battles winding down, I turned my attention to a quieter matter, one I'd been putting off. I had Henry drive me to the cemetery on a cold, clear afternoon. Arthur's headstone was simple, the way he would have wanted. His name, his dates, the words beloved husband and father. I stood there in the winter silence and told him everything. About Crystal, about Marcus, about the houses, about Michael. I told him I'd finally stopped hiding, that I'd finally used the strength he'd always said I had. I left a small stone on top of the headstone, a tradition from his side of the family, and walked back to the car feeling lighter than I had in decades. One last thing remained. The sewing room. For 2 years, that tiny room off the kitchen had been my sanctuary, my retreat from Crystal's hostility. But it was also a symbol of my retreat from life, my willingness to be small and unseen. In February, Michael helped me empty it out. We repainted the walls a soft yellow, moved my bed to a proper guest room upstairs, and turned the sewing room into a small office where I could manage my properties. I hung the deeds on the wall, framed, visible, undeniable, When I sat at my new desk for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt since Arthur died: ownership of my own life. And then the letter arrived. It came in late February, postmarked from Phoenix, Arizona. The handwriting was shaky, the paper cheap notebook stock. Inside was a short note from Harold Pettigrew, the man Crystal had married before Michael. He'd heard about the case, about my testimony, about the way we'd finally stopped her. "I spent 6 years blaming myself," he wrote. 6 years thinking I was the fool who let a con artist destroy my family. But you showed me that it wasn't my fault, and that she could be beaten. Thank you for giving me my dignity back. I read the letter 3 times, folded it carefully, and placed it in the top drawer of my new desk. That drawer would eventually fill with similar letters, from George Murphy's children, from other victims who came forward, from strangers who'd seen their own stories reflected in ours. But the first one, the one from Harold, I never forgot. As winter turned to spring, I began to think about the future in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. I was 72 years old, in good health, with 4 properties and a lifetime of financial security. I could travel, I could volunteer, I could simply rest. But what I wanted most was to teach Michael what I knew. Not just about property management, but about resilience, about standing up for yourself, about how to love someone without losing yourself in the process. He'd started helping with the rental bookkeeping, filing tax documents, even meeting tenants. The boy who'd avoided conflict for 38 years was learning to face things head-on. And I was learning too. Learning to accept help without feeling weak. Learning to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. Learning that being quiet didn't mean being powerless. The night Crystal threw me out, I'd stood in the rain thinking my life was over. But standing in my kitchen on an April morning, with coffee in my hands and sunlight coming through the window, I realized it was only just beginning. The storm had taken everything I thought I needed, and in its place, it had given me back myself. When I think about that Christmas night now, I don't feel anger, not anymore. I feel something closer to gratitude. The storm Crystal thought would destroy me became the thing that washed away the silence I'd wrapped around myself for decades. Sometimes the worst moments are the ones that force us to remember who we really are. There's a lesson I hope you take from this. Don't hide your light and your strength from the people you love. I thought I was protecting Michael by staying small, by making myself invisible so he'd never feel burdened. In truth, I was leaving him vulnerable to someone who preyed on that very silence. Honesty about who you are, what you've built, what you deserve, isn't pride. It's protection. It's armor. And I had disarmed myself in my own home. After the case went public, I started receiving letters, not just from Crystal's other victims, but from strangers who saw their own families in my story. An elderly man in Ohio whose daughter-in-law convinced him to sign over his house. A widow in Florida whose son stopped taking her calls after his new wife said she was too demanding. The patterns were heartbreakingly similar: slow isolation, whispered doubts, then the final push. These predators count on our willingness to be quiet, to not make a scene, to fade away gracefully. And too often, we oblige them. But here's what else those letters showed me. People are resilient. Some recovered their homes. Some rebuilt relationships. Some simply found peace in knowing they weren't alone. One woman wrote, "Your story made me realize I wasn't crazy. I wasn't ungrateful. I was being manipulated. That's why I'm sharing this now, not to dwell on the pain, but to tell anyone listening that you can come back from it. You can reclaim your space, your voice, your life." I forgave Michael because I saw clearly that he was a victim too, of a professional con artist who studied her targets like a predator studies prey. And because he chose to do the hard work of rebuilding, of looking inward, of becoming the son he'd always wanted to be. But I know not everyone would make that same choice. That's the question I leave with you tonight. Could you forgive someone who stood silent while you were cast out, even if they were being manipulated? Where is the line between understanding and enabling? I'm still not sure I have a clean answer. Maybe there isn't one. What I do know is that I'm no longer the woman who slept in a sewing room to make herself smaller. I'm the woman who built 4 houses, raised a son, and faced down a monster in heels. And I did it not by becoming louder, but by finally refusing to be quiet. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. We're building a community of people who know that our best chapters don't have to come early in life. They can come whenever we decide to turn the page. Thank you for listening.